The young woman stepped into the grand music hall, feeling both nervous and strangely calm. Her shoes made soft sounds on the polished wooden floor as she walked past rows of seats, each one filled with people whose eyes seemed to judge her even before she reached the stage. She had been dreaming about this moment for years, and yet now that she was here, it felt different from what she had imagined. The hall was filled with the scent of polished wood, fresh flowers, and the faint perfume of the audience. There was a sense of expectation in the air, a quiet tension that made every movement feel louder than it should be. She carried her music bag carefully, her fingers brushing the edges of it as if it held not just her sheets and notes, but a part of herself. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she tried to remind herself why she was there. Music had been her companion for as long as she could remember, and though life had not always been kind, it had taught her discipline, patience, and the courage to keep moving forward. She looked around at the other performers, some tuning their instruments, others quietly warming up. They all seemed confident, familiar with the way the stage demanded attention. She wondered if they could feel the same nerves she felt, or if they were simply hiding them well. Then she saw him. The elite violinist. He was someone people respected, almost feared in the music world. He had a reputation for brilliance, but also for being harsh to those he considered less skilled. Today, he was sitting quietly, tuning his violin, but his eyes flicked toward her the moment she stepped into the hall. She felt the weight of his gaze, sharp and measuring, and she could sense the unspoken words hovering in the air. She was small compared to his presence, almost invisible, and yet she knew she had to face him without. Flinching, the violinist's expression was a mixture of curiosity and amusement. He leaned back slightly, watching her as if she were a small puzzle piece that didn't belong in the grand picture. His lips curved into a subtle smile, though it was not kind. The audience seemed to notice, and a few murmurs passed among them, small and uncertain. The woman could feel the weight of their expectation, or perhaps it was the weight of their doubt. Either way, she carried it silently, letting it settle around her like a cloak she could not remove. She walked toward the piano at the center of the stage. It was a beautiful instrument, polished and shining under the lights. The keys glimmered, almost inviting her to play, but the invitation felt more like a test than a welcome. She placed her bag down beside the piano and took a deep breath. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear of failure, but from the anticipation of proving herself. This moment was more than a performance. It was a chance to show that years of practice, sacrifice, and quiet determination were not wasted. The audience watched as she adjusted the piano bench, her movements careful and precise. She glanced toward the violinist again, and their eyes met for a brief moment. There was a flash of doubt in his eyes, a question of whether she was really ready for this stage. She did not respond with words, only a small nod, as if acknowledging the challenge without needing to fight it with anger or explanation. She had learned that composure often spoke louder than any argument as she sat down at the piano. She felt the coolness of the keys under her fingers. It was familiar, comforting in a way that the stage lights and the watching eyes were not. She closed her eyes for a brief second, remembering the countless hours she had spent practicing alone in small rooms. In dimly lit corners of her home, when no one was there to see her, when no one believed she could make it. Those memories were her strength now, a quiet fuel that reminded her that she belonged here. No matter what anyone else thought. The violinist shifted in his seat, glancing at her with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. He leaned forward slightly, as if expecting her to falter, to show some sign of weakness. But she remained still, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her posture calm and confident. The audience sensed the tension too, and a quiet hush fell over the hall. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what she would do next. Then, just before she began, a small sound escaped her lips, almost like a whisper to herself. It was a reminder, a silent promise that she was ready. She pressed down on the first key, and a soft, pure note filled the room. It was delicate, yet it carried a confidence that surprised even her. The sound resonated through the hall, bouncing off the walls and floating above the heads of the audience. She took another deep breath and continued, each note flowing naturally. each movement of her fingers precise and intentional as she played. She could feel the initial skepticism in the room begin to shift, even if only slightly. Some eyes widened in surprise, some heads tilted as if trying to understand where such skill had come from. She did not play for them, though. She played for herself, for the music that had always been a part of her, for the silent hours and the hidden struggles that had shaped her into who she was. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a voice, speaking truths that words could never capture. She glanced once at the violinist as she played, noticing the subtle change in his posture. The confidence that had filled his expression was now tinged with uncertainty. He seemed to be reassessing everything he thought he knew about her. That small shift, almost imperceptible to anyone else, gave her a quiet satisfaction. Not because she wanted to prove him wrong, but because she had the chance to show her real self. Without pretense or fear, the first few minutes of her performance passed, and she felt herself settle into a rhythm, a connection with the piano and the room that was deeper than anything she had experienced before. The audience was no longer just watching. They were listening, truly listening. Every note seemed to carry a story, a mixture of emotion, discipline, and the quiet strength that had brought her here. The violinist continued to watch, his expression unreadable, but she could feel that he was beginning to understand the depth of what he was witnessing, despite the nerves that had greeted her. When she first stepped into the hall, she now felt a sense of calm determination. The music was her world, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. The doubts, the judgments, the whispers of the audience, all of it faded into the background as her fingers moved across the keys. She was not just playing notes. She was telling a story, one that was uniquely hers. Built from years of dedication and quiet perseverance, the lights above seemed warmer, the room more intimate, as if the hall itself recognized her effort and skill. She allowed herself a small smile, not of pride, but of acknowledgement. She had made it to this moment through her own hard work and resilience. Every note she played was a testament to that journey, a reminder that talent is only part of the equation and that persistence, courage, and belief in oneself are just as important. The violinist finally leaned back, his posture less rigid, his expression softer. He had watched many performances in his career, but something about her presence and the honesty of her playing was different. It was not flashy or designed to impress. It was sincere, deliberate, and heartfelt. The change in him was subtle, almost imperceptible to the audience, but it was there. He was beginning to realize that the woman he had underestimated might have something extraordinary to offer. As the young woman continued to play, she lost herself in the music. Each note, each pause, each rise and fall of the melody was an expression of everything she had endured and everything she hoped to achieve. The audience was captivated, the whispers and murmurs replaced by attentive silence. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely seen. Not for how she looked or how others had judged her, but for what she could create, for the music that came straight from her heart. By the time she finished the first piece, the hall was silent for a moment, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath, trying to process what they had just heard. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the audience. It was not the polite, hesitant clapping of obligation, but genuine appreciation for the depth and beauty of her performance. She looked up at the violinist, who nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of her talent and the courage it had taken to stand there and play. She stood up from the piano, her hands still tingling from the energy of the music, and allowed herself a small, humble bow. The applause grew louder, filling the room with warmth and recognition. It was a moment she had dreamed of, but it was also more than that. It was a reminder that perseverance, patience, and faith in oneself could turn doubt into opportunity. The young woman had arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, but she had already begun to change the way the audience, and even the elite violinist, saw her. After the applause of her first piece faded, the young woman felt a mixture of relief and tension. Relief that she had performed with the skill and emotion she had hoped to share, and tension because she knew the real challenge was not over. The elite violinist, whose eyes had been sharp and dismissive earlier, was now observing her more carefully. There was no doubt in her mind that he was reevaluating everything he had assumed about her. The air between them was quiet but heavy, charged with the unspoken acknowledgement that something unexpected had happened. As she adjusted her music sheets for the next piece, whispers began to circulate among the audience. Some were impressed, some were still skeptical, but all eyes were now on her. She could feel their attention, but she did not let it distract her. Years of performing in small venues, of facing doubt from teachers, peers, and even family, had taught her to focus on the music and not the noise around it. This was her world, and the piano was the place where she could speak without words, where every note was an extension of herself. The violinist finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying a subtle edge. He made a small comment about the complexity of the piece she was about to play. It was not meant as encouragement, but as a quiet challenge. She listened without reacting, only nodding slightly, understanding that his words were not meant to intimidate, but to test her confidence. She welcomed it. Challenges had always been part of her journey, and she had learned that meeting them head-on often revealed more about herself than about anyone else. She began her next piece, starting with a soft, deliberate melody. This time, the music was slower, more introspective, filled with layers of emotion that could not be conveyed through speed or technical skill alone. Her fingers moved over the keys with a quiet authority, drawing sound from the instrument that was both delicate and commanding. Each note was chosen carefully, as if she were telling a story with a gentle but insistent voice. The audience could sense the depth behind her performance, and even the violinist leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing in concentration as she played. She felt memories of past struggles rise within her. The nights spent practicing alone, the times when no one believed she could succeed, and the small victories that had kept her going all surfaced in the music. It was a subtle, emotional undercurrent that gave her performance a weight beyond technical proficiency. She was no longer just a performer. She was a storyteller, conveying her life's journey through every note. The audience could feel it, even if they did not know the details. They could sense the authenticity in her music, the way it carried truth and experience in a way that mere talent alone could never achieve. The violinist shifted in his seat, clearly unsettled by what he was hearing. He had faced many talented musicians, but there was something different about her. She did not play to show off or to impress. She played to express, to communicate, to connect. It was a subtle difference, but one that was immediately apparent to anyone who truly listened. He had underestimated her not because she lacked skill, but because he had judged her too quickly, relying on assumptions rather than observation. Now, he was forced to reconsider everything he thought he knew. The music grew in intensity, but it never lost its careful balance. She played with emotion, but without excess. There was no showmanship in her performance, only sincerity. Each chord, each transition, each pause was deliberate, shaped by her experience and understanding of the instrument. The audience felt a collective shift in mood, drawn in by the honesty and depth of her playing. Even those who had initially doubted her could not deny the power of what they were hearing. A few moments of silence passed between movements. It's not because she stopped, but because the music demanded it. The pauses were as meaningful as the notes themselves, giving weight and space to the story she was telling. The violinist watched intently, recognizing the precision and thoughtfulness behind every gesture. He had learned over the years that true mastery of music was not just in speed or complexity, but in the ability to communicate and evoke emotion. And here, on this stage, she was demonstrating that skill in a way that was impossible to ignore as she progressed through the piece. Her confidence grew, but it was a quiet confidence, not arrogance. She was aware of the audience, of the violinist, of the subtle tension that hung in the air, but she did not allow it to dictate her performance. Her focus remained on the music, on the story she wanted to tell. Each note was an extension of herself, a reflection of her journey, and a testament to the resilience that had brought her here. The violinist's initial skepticism began to fade, replaced by a grudging respect. He had underestimated her, and now he realized that she possessed something he had rarely seen in musicians of her age. It was not just technical skill, but the ability to convey emotion. to connect with the audience on a deeper level, and to maintain composure under pressure. His earlier assumptions had been superficial, and now he was confronted with the reality of her talent and dedication. The audience responded instinctively, leaning forward in their seats, absorbing the nuances of her performance. Some had tears in their eyes, others had expressions of amazement, and a few simply sat in quiet contemplation. The music had reached a point where it transcended judgment or critique. It was no longer about proving oneself to others, but about creating a shared experience. The young woman felt a sense of unity with the room, a connection that went beyond applause or recognition. Despite the growing admiration around her, she remained grounded. She knew that true mastery was not about seeking approval, but about staying true to oneself. Every keystroke, every pause, every dynamic shift was intentional, reflecting her understanding of music and life. She did not need to impress the violinist or the audience. She needed only to be honest in her expression. That honesty spoke louder than words. As the piece neared its conclusion, the tension in the hall reached its peak. The violinist leaned back slightly, processing the performance with a mixture of awe and reflection. He had been confident in his judgment, certain that she would falter, but now he was forced to acknowledge her capability. The audience, too, was fully engaged, swept up in the depth and emotion of her playing. There was a sense of shared realization, a collective understanding that they were witnessing something remarkable. Finally, the last note resonated through the hall, lingering in the air like a soft echo of the story she had told. There was a moment of silence, profound and reverent, as if everyone was holding their breath, savoring the conclusion of the journey. Then, slowly, applause began to rise, hesitant at first, then growing into a powerful wave of recognition and appreciation. The young woman allowed herself a small, grateful smile, acknowledging the audience without any need for words. She had faced doubt, judgment, and expectation. She had emerged with her truth fully expressed. The violinist stood silently for a moment, processing what he had witnessed. His earlier doubts had been replaced by respect, and though he would not admit it openly, had been humbled by her skill and composure. He approached her quietly, not to challenge or criticize, but to recognize the achievement he had overlooked. In that moment, the hall seemed to shrink, the space between them charged with a newfound understanding. She did not seek confrontation or validation, but she accepted the acknowledgement with quiet dignity. The young woman gathered her music sheets, her fingers still tingling from the intensity of the performance. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from winning approval, but from having shared her music honestly and fearlessly. The applause continued, echoing in the hall, but it was secondary to the feeling that she had expressed herself fully. This performance was not about defeating someone else. It was about affirming her own journey, her own voice, and her own presence in the world of music. As she left the stage for a brief pause, she felt the weight of the moment settle around her. She had faced doubt, challenge, and underestimation, and she had responded not with words, but with action. Her music had spoken for her, and in doing so, it had created a space where respect, understanding, and admiration could flourish. The violinist, the audience, and even she herself had experienced a shift, subtle but profound, that would linger long after the final note faded. It was a reminder that true expression and courage often emerge in the quiet moments between expectation and reality, and that when one remains authentic, the world is forced to take notice. When the young woman returned to the stage after the short pause, the atmosphere in the hall had changed. It no longer felt cold or judgmental. There was curiosity now, and something close to respect. People leaned forward in their seats as she walked back to the piano. She could feel their eyes on her, not weighing her worth anymore, but waiting to hear what she would share next. That shift alone told her she had already crossed an invisible line. She took her seat again, placing her hands gently on her lap before touching the keys. Her breathing slowed, steady and controlled. Inside, her heart was beating fast, but she had learned how to manage that feeling over the years. Nervous energy could destroy a performance if left unchecked, but if guided well, it could also bring life to the music. She reminded herself that she was not there to compete or impress. She was there to speak honestly through sound. The elite violinist was standing now. It's not out of disrespect, but because he could no longer sit comfortably. He held his violin loosely, watching her with full attention. His earlier confidence had faded, replaced by a serious focus. He was no longer seeing her as an outsider. He was seeing her as a fellow musician, someone whose work deserved to be heard without interruption or judgment. She began the next piece differently from the earlier ones. There was no slow introduction this time. The opening notes were firm and clear, filling the hall instantly. The sound carried strength, not loudness, but intention. It was the kind of music that demanded attention without asking for it. Conversations stopped completely. Even those at the back of the hall straightened in their seats. Her fingers moved with ease, but not carelessness. Every motion had purpose. This piece reflected a different side of her, one shaped by struggle and resolve. The melody rose and fell like waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes forceful. It felt honest, almost raw. She was no longer holding anything back. The piano responded to her touch as if it understood her, producing tones that felt alive. As she played, memories surfaced again, but this time they were stronger. She remembered moments when doors were closed on her, when people told her she was not good enough or did not belong. She remembered being ignored during auditions, overlooked in rooms where talent was judged by appearance or background. Those memories did not weaken her now. Instead, they sharpened her focus. They reminded her why she played in the first place. The audience could sense that this performance was different. It carried confidence, but also vulnerability. Some listeners felt a tightness in their chest without knowing why. Others felt inspired, as if the music was reminding them of their own battles. That is what made the moment powerful. It was not perfect or polished for show. It was real. The violinist shifted his grip on the instrument, his face unreadable. He had spent years mastering technique, chasing perfection, building a reputation. But as he listened, he realized that something important had been missing in his own performances lately. He had been focused on precision and recognition, sometimes forgetting the emotional truth that first drew him to music. Hearing her play brought that realization into sharp focus. The music moved into a quieter section, almost fragile. Her touch softened, and the hall followed her lead. People barely breathed. The silence between notes felt heavy with meaning. She allowed the pauses to stretch just enough, trusting the audience to stay with her. That trust was rewarded. No one looked away. No one shifted restlessly. They were completely present. She felt a connection to the room that she had rarely experienced before. It was not about approval. It was about shared understanding. For a few minutes, differences disappeared. Titles, reputations, and expectations no longer mattered. There was only sound, emotion, and attention. That was what she had always hoped music could do. As the piece grew again in strength, her movements became more confident. Her posture straightened slightly, and her hands traveled across the keyboard with certainty. The sound filled every corner of the hall. It was clear now that she was not guessing or testing herself. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every note landed where it was meant to. The violinist lowered his head briefly, not in defeat, but in reflection. He realized that his earlier judgment had been unfair and unnecessary. Talent does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly and reveals itself only to those willing to listen. He wondered how many others he might have overlooked in the past because of similar assumptions. The audience reacted strongly as the music reached its peak. Some pressed their hands together, others closed their eyes. A few nodded slowly, as if the music was confirming something they had felt but never named. This was not just entertainment. It was communication on a deeper level. When the final section began, she felt a calm certainty settle over her. She knew she had given everything she had. Whatever happened after this moment no longer mattered. The performance was complete in her heart. She allowed the music to guide her to the end. Trusting her instincts fully, the final notes rang out strong and clear, then slowly faded into silence. The hall remained quiet for a long moment. No one rushed to clap. It was the kind of silence that meant the music was still working inside people. Then, One person began to applaud. Another followed. Soon the entire hall was filled with applause, louder and more emotional than before. She stood up slowly, feeling the energy of the room wash over her. She did not smile widely or raise her arms. She simply bowed, grateful and steady. Her eyes briefly met the violinist's. This time, there was no doubt in his expression. Only respect. He stepped forward slightly, acknowledging her with a small but sincere gesture. It was not dramatic, but it meant more than words. It was a public recognition that could not be taken back. The audience noticed and responded with even louder applause as she stepped away from the piano. She felt lighter than she had when she first arrived. Not because she had proven someone wrong, but because she had remained true to herself. The weight of being underestimated no longer pressed on her shoulders. She had answered doubt with honesty, and that was enough. Backstage, she paused for a moment alone, letting her hands rest. They trembled slightly now, not from fear, but from release. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Whatever came next, she knew one thing for certain. Her voice had been heard, clearly and without apology, and nothing could take that away from her. When she returned to her seat at the piano for the next piece, the atmosphere in the hall felt charged in a different way. There was no longer skepticism, no quiet judgment. Instead, the audience leaned forward, their attention fully captured by the young woman who had proven her skill and presence twice already. The hall felt alive, almost expectant, as if the walls themselves were listening to her. She looked briefly at the violinist, who was watching intently from the side. He had shifted from a posture of quiet judgment to one of curiosity and focused attention. He was no longer expecting her to falter. Now he seemed to anticipate what she might reveal through her music, his mind quieting to fully absorb what was happening. She allowed herself a moment to note the change, but she did not let it distract her. She had learned long ago that the stage demands focus above all else. Her fingers touched the keys gently at first, producing soft, flowing tones that filled the hall with warmth. The music was slow, deliberate, and intricate. It drew the listeners in immediately, pulling them away from distractions and into the world she created with sound. Each note seemed to breathe, carrying both technical skill and deep feeling. She could feel the audience reacting without moving or speaking, their collective attention wrapped around her music like a quiet wave. The violinist's expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of his realization that he had misjudged her. He had been confident before, sure of his own judgment, but now he was seeing someone whose talent was not just visible on the surface, but embedded deeply in her understanding and expression of music. He had underestimated the depth of her artistry, and the recognition of that truth brought a humbling quiet to him as she continued. The music shifted subtly, moving from soft, introspective passages to stronger, more assertive phrases. Each change was intentional, reflecting her ability to control both the dynamics of sound and the emotions that accompanied them. The audience felt the rise and fall of the melody, experiencing tension and release, as though they were walking a path with her. The room became a space for shared feeling, where each listener responded individually but simultaneously. United by the sound and story unfolding before them, memories from her life surfaced as she played, not as distractions, but as fuel. She remembered moments of doubt, of being dismissed, and of working tirelessly in silence to refine her craft. She thought of the long hours of practice, of the sacrifices made, and of the small victories that had quietly built her confidence over time. These were the things that could not be taught or borrowed. They were hers, and they gave depth and authenticity to every note she played. The hall seemed to pulse with the energy of her performance. Listeners were drawn to the subtle shifts in tone, to the careful phrasing, to the emotion behind each chord. She did not need to play fast or flashy. The music itself was compelling, filled with honesty and a sense of lived experience. This was not performance for the sake of applause. It was an honest expression of self, which in turn inspired recognition and respect from everyone present. The violinist shifted again, leaning forward slightly, his violin resting against his shoulder. He had witnessed countless performances in his career, Yet this young woman had managed to surprise him in ways few could. It was not just her skill that impressed him, but her ability to communicate through music, to draw the audience into a shared emotional experience without needing words. His earlier assumptions, made with ease and confidence, were now exposed as superficial and premature. The young woman's performance continued to evolve. Her hands glided across the keys with precision, but her expression and energy conveyed more than technical mastery. It was as though she was speaking directly to each person in the audience, telling a story without needing language. They were drawn into the narrative, moved by the vulnerability, the strength, and the clarity of her musical voice. She felt the power of connection that only music could create, a bond that transcended appearances, expectations, and judgments. The piece grew in complexity, incorporating both subtle harmonies and bold assertive passages. The audience followed her through each variation, sensing the emotional arc she created. The hall itself seemed to respond, the acoustics carrying each note, each pause, each crescendo with clarity and resonance. She felt no fear, only focus, letting her music guide her, allowing her energy to reach the listeners fully. The violinist's eyes tracked her every move. He understood that the music she produced was not simply a demonstration of skill. It was a statement of identity and resilience. Each phrase conveyed her history, her determination, and her perspective. The realization humbled him. He had assumed he knew her capabilities, but her performance was reshaping his understanding of her completely. Respect replaced judgment. Admiration replaced doubt. The audience reacted as one, leaning into each note, holding breath during delicate passages, relaxing into waves of sound during more expansive moments. This was the kind of attention that performers dream of, not superficial applause, but genuine engagement, a listening that honored the effort and heart behind the music. The young woman felt the presence of the hall, not as pressure, but as shared space where art and emotion could exist freely. As she approached the climax of the piece, her music became richer and more powerful. She allowed herself to express the full spectrum of emotion she had cultivated over years of practice. She trusted her instincts, her experience, and the connection she had with the audience. Every note, every pause, every chord progression carried intention. She was no longer just performing. She was communicating. And that was far more important than any evaluation or opinion. The violinist's expression softened. He was no longer measuring or analyzing. He was listening and absorbing. He recognized the discipline, patience, and courage it took to produce such a performance. His earlier assumptions about her, the underestimation that had framed his thoughts, were no longer valid. He had been given a lesson in humility, delivered not with words, but with the honesty and power of music. The hall seemed to expand and contract with the music, a living echo of the young woman's skill and heart. Each note resonated with layers of meaning, and each pause allowed listeners to reflect and feel. The experience was immersive, drawing everyone into the world she was creating in real time. The audience, including the violinist, could not ignore the artistry and truth of what they were hearing. She allowed the piece to reach its peak, building intensity without losing control. Her fingers danced across the keys, combining technical precision with emotional resonance. The hall was filled with the fullness of her expression. The audience responded instinctively, caught in the wave of sound and feeling. The music spoke directly to their hearts, leaving no room for doubt. Only engagement and connection. When she finally reached the final chord, she held it gently, letting it linger. The silence afterward was profound, a quiet space where the energy of the performance hung in the air. Listeners absorbed the resonance, reflecting on the journey she had created in sound. It was a moment of shared understanding, where every person present felt the power and truth of the music. Then, applause erupted. It was spontaneous, heartfelt, and loud, rising to fill the hall with recognition and appreciation. The young woman rose from the piano, bowing with quiet dignity, acknowledging both the audience and the violinist. There was no need for words. The music had spoken, and its impact was undeniable. The violinist approached her slowly, nodding with sincere respect. This gesture, simple and understated, carried the weight of acknowledgement that she had earned through her perseverance, skill, and authenticity. The moment was more meaningful than any public recognition or critique. It was a shared understanding of the power of dedication, honesty, and expression. She stepped away from the piano, her fingers tingling from the intensity of the performance, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This piece, like the previous ones, was not about defeating doubt or proving herself. It was about communicating truth, expressing emotion, and sharing a part of herself that could not be measured by appearances or assumptions. The hall had witnessed that truth, and the impact would linger far beyond the final note. In this moment, she understood something important. Talent and practice are essential, but so are courage and authenticity. By staying true to herself and trusting her abilities, she had created a space where music transcended expectation and judgment. The respect she had earned, especially from the violinist who had underestimated her, was secondary to the satisfaction of expressing her voice fully and sincerely. When she rose from the piano for the final time, a calm clarity settled over her. The hall was still alive with applause and murmurs of admiration, but she felt a deep, personal sense of completion. It was not about recognition or proving herself to anyone anymore. It was about honoring the journey that had brought her here through countless hours of practice, the moments of doubt and perseverance, and the courage to perform honestly in front of those who had once underestimated her. The violinist remained standing, watching her quietly. His earlier skepticism had completely disappeared. Now he seemed almost reflective, as if reconsidering not only his opinion of her, but also the assumptions he carried into every performance he had ever witnessed. She had challenged more than his expectations. She had reminded him of the deeper purpose of music and the humility required to truly appreciate it. There was no need for words between them. The respect was mutual and unspoken. Flowing as naturally as the music she had played, she gathered her music sheets, tucking them carefully into her bag. Her hands tingled from the energy of the performance, and her heart felt lighter than it had in years. This was the culmination of everything she had worked for, and the knowledge of that was far more valuable than any applause or praise. She felt grateful for the experience, for the challenge, and even for the moments of doubt that had forced her to dig deeper and find strengths she did not always know she had. The audience continued to applaud, some rising to their feet in ovation. She allowed herself a small bow, acknowledging them with a quiet smile. She had learned over time that genuine acknowledgement required neither arrogance nor exaggerated gestures. Simple, honest gestures carried the weight of sincerity, and the audience responded to that honesty. They had witnessed not just a performance, but the embodiment of perseverance and the triumph of quiet dedication over judgment. She stepped off the stage slowly, her footsteps measured, feeling the collective energy of the hall still surrounding her. Backstage, she paused for a moment, letting herself breathe fully. Her mind replayed the events of the evening, the initial judgment of the violinist, the quiet tension in the room, the way the music had shifted the focus of everyone present. It had been a delicate balance between control and emotion, precision and feeling, and she had navigated it with care. That balance had allowed her to speak without words, to express herself fully through her instrument. The violinist approached her then, holding his violin loosely at his side. There was no need for dramatic gestures or formal words. He simply nodded, a subtle acknowledgement of her talent, dedication, and courage. It was a recognition earned through performance rather than debate, through action rather than argument. She returned the gesture with a polite, grateful smile, understanding that this quiet exchange carried more significance than any public declaration could. As she walked toward the exit, she noticed how the atmosphere in the hall had transformed. The audience members who had once whispered or looked skeptical were now silent, absorbed in reflection or quietly discussing the power of the performance they had witnessed. She realized that the effect of music was profound. It had the ability to change perspectives, to challenge assumptions, and to evoke emotion in ways that words often could not. Her journey had not just been personal. It had touched everyone who had been willing to listen. She thought about the violinist again, recalling his initial doubts and subtle derision. That memory no longer carried bitterness, only understanding. He had been human, as fallible as anyone, and she had been human as well, facing challenge with honesty and focus. The interaction between them had been a test, not of skill alone, but of patience, composure, and integrity. She had met that test, and the results were evident not just in the audience's reaction, but in the transformation she had observed in him. Outside the hall, the night air was cool and refreshing. She stepped onto the quiet street, allowing herself a moment of reflection. This performance was a milestone, but it was also a beginning. The experience had reinforced the importance of authenticity, discipline, and resilience. It had shown her that recognition was fleeting, but the impact of genuine effort, courage, and honesty could ripple far beyond the immediate moment. She carried that realization with her, feeling both humbled and empowered. The young woman's thoughts drifted to her future. She understood that challenges would come again, that doubt and skepticism were inevitable. But she also knew that she now possessed the confidence and inner strength to navigate those challenges with grace. Her music had become her voice, and she would continue to use it to communicate, to inspire, and to express herself without compromise. That knowledge brought a quiet joy, a steady assurance that no matter the obstacles ahead, she was prepared. She walked home slowly, the streets bathed in soft light. Each step felt like a continuation of the journey she had begun years ago, a journey of discipline, dedication, and self-discovery. Her mind replayed fragments of the evening, the first note that caught the audience's attention, the subtle shifts in the music, the moment she felt the hall respond collectively to her expression. Every detail reinforced the lesson she had learned, that talent alone was not enough, and that courage, authenticity, and persistence were equally vital as she reached her front door. She paused for a moment to take in the quiet of the night. She felt gratitude for the opportunities she had received, for the challenges she had faced, and for the music that had carried her through. This performance had been a culmination of years of effort, but it was also a reminder that the journey never truly ends. Each performance, each practice session, each moment of doubt or triumph was part of an ongoing story. One she was determined to continue writing with honesty and heart. Inside, she set down her bag and allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time in hours. She sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on the evening, and then slowly began to unpack her music sheets, carefully placing them in order. The process was soothing, a return to routine after the intensity of the performance. She felt the satisfaction of completion, a calm sense that she had honored herself, her craft, and everyone who had witnessed her work. Her mind wandered back to the violinist, who had underestimated her at the beginning of the night. That memory no longer carried any resentment, only a recognition of growth, both hers and his. The evening had proven that preconceptions were fragile, and that sincerity, dedication, and skill could reshape even the most entrenched judgments. She smiled softly, understanding that every encounter, every challenge, was an opportunity to demonstrate who she truly was. As the night deepened, she allowed herself a final reflection on what had transpired. She realized that the most significant part of the evening was not the applause, the acknowledgement from the violinist, or even the admiration from the audience. It was the affirmation of her own journey, the recognition of her resilience, and the quiet knowledge that she had expressed herself fully and authentically. That realization carried more weight than any external validation ever could. Finally, she rose from her seat, stretching lightly, and felt a profound sense of peace. The music had spoken, the audience had listened, and the violinist had acknowledged her. She had navigated doubt, challenge, and underestimation with integrity and focus. The experience had been transformative, a testament to the power of persistence, authenticity, and courage. She understood, more deeply than ever, that her voice, expressed through music, was something no one could take from her. With that thought, she stepped into the quiet night, carrying the satisfaction of accomplishment and the promise of continued growth. The performance was over, but the impact remained on the audience, on the violinist, and most importantly, on herself. She walked forward with confidence and grace, ready for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. fully aware that the strength she had cultivated within would always guide her, and that her music, honest and heartfelt, would continue to speak for her when words alone could not.